Well, I thought I might spare you a PowerPoint, since you probably PowerPointed out, being that we're now cruising into the downhill slope of the conference itself. As Mike pointed out, I'm with the MCC, and as kind of the new kid on the block, a lot of people don't know who we are and what we do. We've been mistaken for the Millennium Development Goals. Stick Millennium in your name, you're bound to get something like that. We've been referred to by prime ministers as the Millennium Challenged Corporation, which is probably more accurate than I care to admit on most days. And many people think we're actually a company because of the name corporation stuck in there. To tell you a little bit about ourselves, the MCC was formed in 2004 under President Bush. And it was an attempt, anyway, to, as its core mission, to reduce poverty through economic growth. To do this, and to kind of contextualize how we address our issues, the MCC was set up to kind of reward countries who were better performers. To do that, the MCC set up 17 independently gathered composite indicators that evaluate how a country is performing overall. They have to meet a threshold that's competitively based. They have to compete against their other cohort groups. And by the very nature of that, it was hoped there would be an MCC effect, which has been taking place, in that countries interested in getting our funding would try to improve their scores and their indicators. Now, admittedly, there are all kinds of issues associated with that in terms of lags and delays, in terms of the indicators and how it's measured. And then there's always the occasional country that performs very well and then has a coup, which kind of throws our indicators a little bit into whack. But those are the issues we deal with in terms of reality. Currently, the MCC has a range of compacts. Our smallest one is $70 million. Our largest one is $700 million. I thought that was big until my colleagues started talking, and now I feel like the really small guy on the block after talking to them. We currently have 20 compacts negotiated. These compacts last for about 5 years, and a little bit over $7.2 billion funding these 5-year programs. If I'm a little discombobulated, we're in the process of now negotiating a compact with Malawi this week, which will hopefully be signed in January for about $350 million. We also work with our sister agency, USAID, on what's called a threshold program, which is about another $500 million, which we are using to try to help countries reach that threshold of being eligible for a compact. And so it is addressing the indicators where they're showing some weakness. Now, the way that MCC works is that it was trying to live up to kind of developmental best practices. And so it was formed under certain principles that development should be country-led. The countries themselves should define what their needs are. They should come to us with a request for what they think they need to address basically constraints to growth. Now, we do take them through a formalized process of identifying those constraints, but the obligation, roles, and responsibilities for kind of defining what they need falls to them. Now, that produces a slightly different scenario. We don't have earmarked money for climate change. We don't have specific programs designated for climate change. But what it does do is produce a collection of countries which is slightly different than some of our other agencies. We work in more stable countries. We work in countries that have been identified as being better performers, by and large. We work in countries that have demonstrated good governance, engagement with civil society, that have invested in their people. So they've invested particularly in girls' education. They've invested in social services and education, by and large. And so we aren't working in countries that don't have good systems in place, by and large, I would say. Hard to generalize in that sense. We don't work in a relief context unless a relief situation hits our countries. So in that sense, the MCC benefits from the fact that we are working with a cohort of countries that tends to be already better performers. Now, that doesn't come without its challenges. Now, as many as you may think, well, it must be easy working at MCC, I'll put some applications in the back table, and you can figure that out after I get finished talking whether it's a good idea or not. Country ownership comes with its own challenges. And let's just be honest about that. While the environmental impact assessment has largely been adopted in many of the countries where we work, the capacity to do it can be very lacking. And many of you who are working in this field know this very well. We also know that the ministries of the environment are, by and large, the worst funded agencies in many of the countries where we work. And yet we are oftentimes hoisting upon them the responsibility to working through country systems of being able to manage and monitor some fairly large and significant projects. Now, it bears mentioning as well that MCC also has the added constraint of our funding is 5 years. So not only are we working at a fairly large scale, not as large as my colleagues here, but we're working at a fairly large scale, we're putting the additional burden of implementing oftentimes very large infrastructure projects within a 5-year time frame, with the burden of completion risk and the desire to move that forward. And yet we're saddling oftentimes the countries themselves and their agencies with their ability to monitor that. And so that represents an additional challenge that we oftentimes at MCC spend a lot of our time trying to enhance that capacity, to work with them to meet certain thresholds of standards. As part of country ownership, our environmental guidelines stipulate the use of country systems. We have found, though, that in many cases we've had to enhance that as well with certain standards. MCC, like our other colleagues, is also adopting the IFC performance standards. We also have our MCC guidelines and our gender policy, which are oftentimes used to complement what is already being done through the EIA process in the countries themselves. Now, how does that actually translate? We haven't worked on greenhouse gas emissions. What I was going to focus on much more is how climate change has been raised as an issue through the EIA process, through the projects that are presented to us. Most of our projects are very much large infrastructure programs. There's agriculture, there is water and sanitation, there's education, there's health. But because our compacts are fairly large amounts of money provided under a 5-year time frame, there is a disproportionate amount of infrastructure, transport, energy projects that are part of that. MCC went through a process of evaluating its existing compacts about 2 years ago. And in that, what we were trying to look at is what were the opportunities to have enhanced climate change, or what projects were actually doing work in climate change. Now, instead of looking exclusively at the greenhouse gas question, we were also looking at what is it the MCC can do to help enable increased climate resilience. What can the MCC do to enable adaptation to threats of climate change, to extreme climate events, to, for lack of a better word, climate-proofing infrastructure, so that the premise of what we're going to build it, to what standard we're going to build it, takes into consideration how climate is changing in many regions of the world. In reviewing that, we actually found that quite a few of our projects did include climate change as an element of what they were doing. We had forest management projects in El Salvador, watershed protection projects in Cape Verde, wetland restoration programs in Lesotho, rangeland management projects in Namibia, Mongolia, ecosystem tourism projects to enhance protected areas, alternative energy projects in Ghana, Mongolia, and a few others. We were working to reduce leakage of methane from pipes in Georgia. And that project we actually took to the development of attempting to try to get carbon credits for that project itself. We have reforestation projects in Mozambique and Morocco. The missed opportunity more than anything else is we never actually went through the process of calculating what that meant in terms of either sequestration of carbon, reduced emissions from carbon per se, or to actually diligence them to the sense of how is this actually enabling either resilience or adaptation. So after that review, we've been now working on how do we enhance our due diligence process to take into consideration climate change, and how do we build that into many of the programs that are being presented to us. Recognizing, of course, the constraint that we face. Country ownership is country ownership. And so we play a role as much of convincing our partner countries of the importance of this, or having them convince us this is worth our investment as well. I wanted to take a couple case studies of our recent experience of attempting to build climate change into our EIA process, and very kind of polar differences in terms of how the countries themselves have addressed this issue. And trust me, it's hopefully a good ending so the countries themselves won't be embarrassed by me raising these kind of issues. Moldova had approached us with the idea of investing in originally 80 central irrigation systems. Now, this is not your mom and dad's treadle pump out there. These are Soviet-era irrigation systems where the hydraulic head on some of these things was over 400 meters. They were pumping up to reservoir after reservoir and actually pumping them up quite high. And at one point in the 1980s, Moldova was irrigating close to 500,000 hectares of agricultural fields using these central irrigation systems. Under the original proposal to us, they had offered 28 CIS's, central irrigation systems, for rehabilitation. Over the course of the negotiations with them, we focused on 16 of them that provided good economic returns and a good investment.